Good evening, all. I'm Dustin, also known as Rope Aficionado, and welcome to the Dominance Dialogues. This is the podcast where we explore the psychology, the sociology, and the culture of BDSM. And in tonight's episode, From Shame to Empowerment, Navigating Sexuality, we have with us Dr. Gloria Brame. Gloria, do you mind introducing yourself and a little bit about your experience and background, please?
I first came to fame in 1993 when I published Different Loving, which was the first book ever to be sympathetic to kinky sex and to question what is really normal sex and what is really normal for people. And at the time, we didn't have much science on that. But we certainly had a lot of anthropological records and a lot of historical documents that showed that people had always done this stuff. They didn't have our toys, and they didn't have, these companies manufacturing them by the millions these days. But, going back to certainly ancient Rome and earlier, you could see that in ancient Rome, that some of the ecstasy and secret rituals and secret societies enjoyed things like whippings and role play, if you will, and orgiastic pleasure through what we today could look at and say, wow, that's really kinky. But at the time, it just was what it was. It was just rituals and eroticism combined into a form that was recorded through art. No podcasts. But I'm sure if they had podcasts, they would have conducted them in the day because our kind of sexuality in specific, and really all forms of eroticism, including pornography, sex work, gender variation, and all the rest of it, seems to be a genetic part of life. It is something that has happened or occurred throughout human history. And as the earliest records show, people always liked looking at dirty pictures, and people were really obsessed with naked bodies and genitalia. So that's the kind of thing. And for the book that I wrote on BDSM, obviously my focus was on finding documentation, or as it turned out, a lot of literature that included things that today we would definitely know how to label, but which in the day, as I said, just were what they were. They were just the curious sexual tastes of our ancestors. And today we have an awful lot of labels that have broken down what it all means or what it means to individuals. So my journey in life was transformed by the publication of that book. I was a college professor, I was a journalist, and I was not getting hired after that book came out because I published it under my real name and, well, and experienced the consequences of being considered so controversial about a subject that remains very taboo. But I have zero regrets. I think the work that I do is important. I feel it serves a purpose. I love the people that I get to work with. I love helping people overcome shame. That's a key theme that pops up in my therapy. So I'm in a pretty good place. It was a struggle. It's still a struggle, but it'll always be a struggle. And I knew that at the outset. I understood from the start that it was very misunderstood, because I misunderstood it until I realized, wait a minute, I'm one of them. Oh my, and it was strangely liberating, because until then I really had no language for all of the attitudes that I had about sex, and suddenly I did. So it was kind of very freeing, and I wanted to share what I had learned from significant academic research and translate it into something that maybe could give people comfort and restore their self-esteem or build their pride and help them to see that they weren't alone. Very important. Because in my generation, everybody like me felt insanely alone.
I know I felt alone. Absolutely. And community has helped that. And more so, I think that you hit on something that was very important. And I may or may not have connected the dots prior, but not as quickly as you have or helped me. And that's language. Language is what helped me feel less alone, more so than community, to be honest. To know
Right.
that there are terms to what we do. And this brings up a question based off of some of what you said, that a lot of what we see, correct me if I'm wrong, the phrase or the term would be sexual deviance, is not abnormal. It's something that we've seen throughout all of history, through most of culture, but prior to modern history, lacked labels. Just your opinion, what do you think either prevented labels being made for the various acts that we do now and we have done for hundreds of years? Or what do you think promoted us to make labels now?
Well, it really, in the 19th century, in the late 1880s, let's say 1886 or so, the first studies of sexuality were undertaken by men of science. Those men of science included Freud, a lot of names you haven't heard of, and in their attempt to unravel the mystery of sexuality and how it features in human life, they assigned a range of labels to these things, including calling things deviant, including coming up with the term sadomasochism, which BDSM doesn't really, the community thought they were, called themselves S&M because of the labels that were first set by psychiatrists in the 19th century. The problem is that a lot of people don't resonate with that. First of all, very few of us find Desaad truly erotic because he's so problematic and violent, and outrageous. And von Massock was a minor figure who was only somewhat known even in his own time for having written a book called Venus and Furs, which was about a man who was masochistic. So people did not really resonate with that. And in order to gain acceptance, over time, political activists in the 1990s and early 2000s made the decision sort of collectively within the community to switch to something that would be a bit more palatable and more inclusive of the variations, because BDSM stands for bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadomasochism. And I think that the labeling by psychiatry various kinds of personalities and ordering them into like disordered personalities and healthy personalities and psychopathic personalities, and assigning all of these labels. And the pushback by people who had not the mental illnesses, but let's say being called deviants, for example, there was enough, I mean, even through the 1960s, masturbation was considered deviant sexuality. And so, according to psychiatrists, and certainly in 1993, when my book came out, I was accused by the editor of Psychology Today at the time for, absolutely subverting the whole meaning of love by applying loving to kinky sex. It can't be loving, it's all violence, is, pretty much what she said. So, I mean, one of the most interesting things is how sexuality constantly evolves, but it isn't a linear progression. You, throughout history, have seen stages where sexual freedom becomes a thing. Alexander the Great, himself openly bisexual, had a very lenient kind of sex positive or sex, friendly culture. But it only lasted for a period of time, to be followed by people who wanted to shut it all down and thought that that was disgusting, And with technology, we are seeing evolutions that cycle much faster than that. So I think that with the public participation on the internet, the endless threads and arguments and commentary and opinions by a lot of different individuals, people say, well, I'm not this, I'm that, For example, what about us people who are only drawn to other people if we think they're really smart? We need a name. We don't fit into any of the existing categories. So demisexual. And what about us? We're not really into having partnered intimacy at all. It's just not that interesting to us. Well, we're asexuals, or, that's why a lot of people, they have this long list of newer labels, because it's all towards, in an effort, I think, to be able to self-define and determine what their authentic identity is. So, terms like transvestism and even homosexuality, those came a lot later. In other words, in the history of humanity. Let's say we started, 6,000, 10,000 BC, probably not much language for it then. It started to creep in when people began developing the ability to write things down, when they left the oral traditions and moved to written traditions, and suddenly words became super important. And the growth of Western science in the 19th century, and for the first time, science based on evidence, not alchemical speculations, but things that seemed to have legs, although they really didn't, because there was so little real science in the 19th century. And that is another problem, or one of the problems I discussed in Different Loving, was that all of these psychiatrists, they didn't have any research that they could really point to that could prove that they were right about all of these things. It was really kind of speculative. It was based on an unhappy person showed up and that person had a fetish. Well, so they had to come up with a word for what describes a behavior where you love a shoe. What describes a behavior where you can only get off on a pointy hat? Because it was the 19th century. That was a big thing. Shoe buttons, pointy hats, the fashions of the day, and people were, and they would have a client who was obsessed with it, and that gave him or her the greatest pleasure in the world, and they didn't know what to make of it. So it wasn't like they could get on the internet and Google it.
Yeah.
And right. So as a scholar myself, albeit in a different field at the time, but as a scholar, I was looking at their evidence, there was none, and their assumptions. And there were a lot of those, because these were, no insult to, guys, because I love men, but these guys were very Victorian, very patriarchal, European men, i.e. white men, and they define things according to religious beliefs. So the religious philosophy of the time was that sex was not for pleasure. God wanted us to use sex uniquely for reproduction. Therefore, it needed to be confined in a marriage. It was a very, very narrow view. And the assumption was that anything that wasted seed, as they said in the Bible, that wasted seed, like masturbation, for example, or homosexuality, where no children were possible of the union, those things really became demonized. So things that had been considered perhaps either ignored or considered sins by religious folk sort of were affirmed through psychiatry as deviant or normal. And needless to say, a lot of religious people really liked that because it backed up what they had believed, and they preached that and continued to preach it, and to this day continue to preach it. But the whole premise of it as a field of scientific inquiry at this point in history is kind of laughable, because unlike the people of today who do in fact go out and do large-scale studies and detailed medical studies about all of these things, it turns out that an awful lot of people would horrify the Victorians, because there's just a huge number of people who might identify as, whether they do it out loud or not, whether they do it when they take surveys, we have to assume, given how many people have come out, that there are 10 times as many of them who never will, or who never even have an opportunity to meet somebody and develop the language to talk about it. And if you don't have the language to talk about it, it's very hard to think about it, because linguistics is everything when it comes to processing information.
Absolutely. Language is very important. And I think this is like a perfect segue into my actual first official question for you.
Oh,
and that no,
I thought we were on number 3 already. Oh no. Okay.
Well, I mean, we've touched on some of that, but I would like you to have the opportunity to dive a little bit deeper, right? When you've talked about how society has changed, you've talked about a broad spectrum outside of your personal experience, but you've been a leader in the field of sexuality for over 30 years. How have societal attitudes towards sexuality evolved during that time specifically?
Well, my time being a voice in this field coincides with the advent of the internet. And I would say that the internet has been an unbelievably powerful force in accelerating evolution, because suddenly you had an opportunity for people who didn't have the language and who never told anybody their secret and never had a conversation about any of these things. And that really covers the very broadest spectrum of all kinds of sexual behaviors that are not heteronormative binary. So in other words, everything from swinging and poly and ethical non-monogamy to hardcore kink and softcore kink and sex work of all kinds. And, these conversations really found a public platform on the internet. And before the internet was this big, am I allowed to curse here? Probably not.
Of course you are. Thank you for asking.
Okay. Corporate clusterfuck. Before the corporate clusterfuck descended upon the internet that we know today, it was a pretty free place. I was a very early adapter. I got online. I started when I was, I worked as I worked on Wall Street, and I was a research analyst. And that's where I actually got acquainted with using modems and computers to communicate. So I was very early. After that, I started doing it at home, and I started joining these various groups. And the internet had not yet completely formed. And then came the World Wide Web. And once the World Wide Web was fully functional, which took a couple of years, you saw a completely different environment start to come in. It went from unregulated, unmodified, uncensored conversations all over the internet, and a lot of really edgy porn of a kind that we don't even see today. And politicians drew in the reins somewhat, but it is really kind of waffled up and down, So the 80s, untrammeled freedom on the internet, but very few people. In the 90s, people were really starting to be interested in the technology and starting to join in mass numbers. And with them came corporations and a desire on the part of politicians to attempt to control content on the internet. So in 96, there was the Communications Decency Act, which closed down a lot of sites and terrified a lot of people. I mean, like sex workers, porn stars, all the people who had started to figure out ways to make money through the internet, but also just average civilians who had these interests and got very scared that they were going to be arrested. 2 years later, it was thrown out, because a court decided it was unconstitutional and violated our First Amendment rights for free speech. But there's been a sense of unease on the internet ever since then about too much openness. That hasn't stopped, places like Pornhub from opening and taking chances, or OnlyFans from platforming very graphic behavior, that kind of goes beyond the old days when, think about it, when I was young, you had to go to a store and buy a video or an 8mm tape or something, Is it millimeter? I guess a reel. You had to buy this stuff to watch it, and you would watch it in your home in secret, or maybe you would watch it, in a porn, if you were lucky enough. I was in New York, lots of porn places you could go to and watch their little, short videos that were wild. It was really wild. And then again, censorship, the more like today, what we're seeing are social media platforms that are really huge corporate conglomerate type companies, and they're dictating the rules. So now with a new president who, and conservatives controlling Congress and the White House, they have traditionally been the party that has objected the most vehemently to all depictions of anything that is not church approved or temple approved or synagogue approved, or you know what I mean? So today's kids know more about sex than their grandparents, at least in terms of facts about masturbation. And, they really do tend to know more. They've certainly been, for better and worse, exposed to stuff since a very early age. Again, since I'm a bit older, in the 70s, there were women who didn't even know what a blowjob was. There were men who didn't know what a blowjob was. And that's almost incomprehensible to the internet population at large, because everybody knows what that is.
Bill Clinton didn't know what it was in the 90s, so.
Right, because he's old school too. He's like 10 or 15 years older than me. So in his generation, even more so, or I should say less so, But absolutely, the internet has accelerated everything beyond imagining. There was no way that people in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even the 80s, maybe even the 90s could have even predicted we would have come this far, But it can always change at any minute. As I pointed out in one of my books, I have a series of books called The Truth About Sex, and I'm finally going to finish it. It's supposed to be a trilogy. I only got the first two done, but I'm going to write the third one next, the final one, where I look at a lot of the contemporary phenomena as well, because it's been 30 years since that groundbreaking book that I wrote, New Ground to be Broken, but also a reflection on what's happened. But, it really always depends on the political mood of the country or the nation or the municipality or wherever you are. It really is going to depend on who's in control and what their attitudes are about sex. So if you have people running your immediate world, and they disapprove heavily, and they feel that it's all dirty and that nobody should see it, and that, oh my God, it's, children will see it and their lives will be ruined, et cetera, it's all going to turn extremely conservative. And a lot of the things that we once took for granted online, like seeing naked boobies, I don't know, it may not be possible. People say that's inconceivable. I don't think it's inconceivable at all, because if you read enough history, it's highly conceivable. Things come and go, and it's not because the thing itself is different. As I said, people have practiced everything under the sun since people have existed, right? But it's all in the attitudes of the people who have power as to whether or not things like, well, we're seeing it with transgender people now, if they're really anti-trans and transphobic and really hate people because they're different from them, they can put an end to so many different freedoms. They can deny the science behind transgenderism, which they're already doing, and it can become a shockingly different world. And it can really literally happen so fast that, it could all change. I shouldn't say overnight, but it can all change the course like in a year.
Oh, that's fast.
And but that is, well, that in part is also in part is because of the speed of technology in communicating messages to large groups of people now, to be able to reach them in ways that we couldn't before, to be able to form, as we see, tribes, and to align ourselves with one movement or another movement, or to take it one way or another. And I'm sorry to say this, but, since I studied that period, I know that there was a large, thriving kink, trans, gay community in Berlin that was really blossoming and flourishing in the 1930s. And within 1 or 2 years of Hitler taking power, it was gone. It was just gone. All of the clubs were closed. A lot of the patrons were arrested, and the rest went into hiding and laid low and went right back into the closet and maybe didn't come out again. And since we have so many different movements now of people, it's really hard to say. I knew that, like, in the early days of the kink community, like if a club got busted, which happened pretty often, you might have a handful of people who would come back and take the risk again. But most people avoided it because nobody wanted to have their lives ruined by jail time or, and public outing. So it's really hard to know where we are. I would have said something very different a year ago. But right now, this is the conversation among sex activists. We don't know. It's all full of uncertainty. I know that just from reading history, it's expected to go up and down and up and down. But nobody really wants to live through the downtimes.
Yeah.
Especially not me. But, it's just the reality of the world.
Combination of one of my questions and then listening to some of your some of your thoughts, it sounds like a lot of sexual shame has a direct correlation to political influence.
Well, sex is by nature very political because, and this will actually be relevant when we're talking about shame too, right? Yeah, because that is where a lot of the shame comes from. It isn't just political, it's also religious. And it's also social. As far as we know, like, let's say, talking about shame. Hey, folks, he sent me the question, so I know he wanted to talk about I know he wanted to talk about shame. But, long before we had modern Christianity or modern Judaism or Islam or any of the major religions, people were still felt shameful about sex, right? We left the Garden of Eden and suddenly we were put on clothing. So one may assume that there is something about human nature that makes us extremely protective of the lower part of our body. Not all the way down to the feet. Feet are fine. But you know what I mean. And I can only speculate. I don't believe there's any one force. I mean, politics are pretty much the sum of the will of the people, especially in a society where you have a democratic voting system. So you could say that, well, it's what people wanted. Religions are there to serve our needs and presumably protect our souls. Do some people use religion to gain power and control over other people? Absolutely. But do most of them? I don't think so. I think that, again, it's no one source. No one controls sex. Or at least you can control the open discussion of sex and the open expression of sex, or the open discussion of gender, or the open expression of gender. But you can't really control that except by making people feel super ashamed and scared of not conforming to what they're saying is the norm.
That's perfect to lead me into the next actual question. We're bouncing all around, but it's great.
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. This is exactly what I wanted. This is meaningful conversation. And sounds like there's a lot of influences where shame stems from, some speculatory, some provable, right? What I apologize. Let me step back. How can individuals begin to confront their sexual shame? We can't control the external influences. What can we do internally?
A lot. Because we don't have to accept the social narratives of the day. We don't have to accept, just because Freud said there was a thing called penis envy, doesn't necessarily mean there is a thing called penis envy. And, just because a scholar said this or that. I mean, I really lean hard today, which blows my mind because I was an English professor, but here I am. I lean hard on the science. I lean hard on the medical science, to a much lesser extent, psychiatry, which I feel still hasn't really caught up with the times, although they've done a lot better, especially overseas. Not so much in the US. We're behind many nations in Europe in terms of being accepting of the diversity of sex and gender in human beings. And your question is, what can we do inside? I think the first and most important thing is to believe that you deserve to be happy. It's to build faith in yourself that what you want and what you need and what really gives you joy is as valid as anything else. And of course, as long as it harms none, as long as you're not hurting another life or another person. So, for example, pedophilia is the worst. It should be completely criminalized. Why? Because as a therapist, I can tell you that nothing causes harm the way sex abuse of a minor can cause harm. Complete emotional harm that disempowers a person. On the other hand, homosexuality doesn't cause any harm. It's all, one hopes, consensual adult males doing what they need to do to feel good about themselves, to feel loved, to be able to express love. And this is how, of course, I approach kink as well. I don't see anything wrong with kink unless the person doing it is bringing a very unhealthy attitude towards it. So the best thing you can do for yourself is to learn to fully accept yourself and give yourself permission to be happy. And that means figuring out who you are. If you need 80 labels to do it, okay. If you don't like any labels, just as good. But it's about knowing what really makes you happy, where you feel a sense of peace and a sense of joy. And since it involves sex, one also hopes a sense of ecstasy, true ecstasy. Because that is actually, metaphysically, what we were made for.
So I have a really hard question for you.
Okay.
Well, you said you deserve to be happy, and I
Mhm.
believe you. I don't believe, actually, I know that is the truth. I believe that you can believe something or you can know something. Belief is doubt. And I know that people deserve to be happy. In my experience, specific to Western culture, because that's where I was raised, there still is shame attached to happiness. If you're happy, then there can be shame attached to that.
Right. And that actually is a much more Calvinistic, shall we say. There are indeed a number of religions that believe that the only heaven you should ever know is when you die. And that there is no heaven on earth. And that pleasure itself is, I blame the Greek Stoic philosophers for coming up with the idea. But, there have always been people who are anti-pleasure and anti-happiness. You get to choose, though. You see, you don't have to cling to a culture that you find depressing, who is constantly trying to hold you down. You have other choices, certainly in the United States. Maybe not everywhere in the world, but in the United States, we're just such a, generously, abundantly diverse country with so many different cultures. And you can find your own people. You can find people like you. And the reason I think people all deserve to have joy is because that is, to me, sort of the meaning of life. The meaning of life is to be able to live life to the fullest. The meaning of life is to experience happiness. And I feel very, very sad for people who are not dealing with tragic circumstances, but actually choose to not be happy, to not pursue pleasure, to not enjoy the life that they have.
It's interesting because it's funny you called out stoicism. I occasionally will scroll through on social media, and there was, I'm going to horribly misquote it, so I'm not going to really quote it, but it was a reel saying that Socrates must have hated his wife and invented stoicism, and essentially that was a reason for reason over emotion, because he was a reasonable man and his wife was an emotional woman.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, at some point in life, there was like, as a man, I thought I was supposed to be stoic, that I was supposed to be the strong, silent type, especially given some of my cultural upbringing. And as a man, I say to hell with that. I want to feel emotion, good, bad, and
Mm-hmm.
ugly. The value to that emotion is the value that I put on it. And I've said it before, I could be happy for good reasons and I can be happy for bad reasons. I could be sad for good reasons and I could be sad for bad reasons. It's up to me as an individual to determine the value in that emotion. I don't think any emotion is inherently good,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that the emotion is part of human, and I think it's actually
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that elevates their intelligence above a lot of other mammals. And I don't want to get lost in the science of all of that. Well, but specifically men, like we need to embrace our emotions. And this is something that I probably needed to say to myself 10 or 15 years ago, potentially. But
Men, yeah, men punish themselves too hard.
uh,
They really do. They're taught to do that. There's a great push against men to be inhuman, not to really fully enjoy the human experience, but to see themselves, like I feel really sad for guys who are like, I'm a warrior. Well, what do you do in your off time, warrior? You know? If you're a warrior all the time, does that mean you don't know love? Your children never see tenderness from you? What does that really mean? If you're always fighting with the world in your head, what joy are you ever going to find?
I just instantly thought of the movie 300 and Leonidas and Spark, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean, in some people that is like the epiphany of a warrior. But like you said, um, what are you when you're not at war? There's a something I really, really like that Jordan Peterson said was that the I believe he said it was the definition of a good man is a man that is capable of being violent, has the capacity to know when to use it. And this goes back, I'm a father. And I hope that my daughter never has to see that warrior side of me. But if I ever need to protect for her, this part of
Mm-hmm.
my in my head, I don't know what other word to say, duty as her father, as that male role model in her life is to provide and protect. And
Mm-hmm.
most of that is hopefully love, provide love and safe space. But occasionally you may have to protect, right?
Right. But I'm really talking about people who believe that because they're this thing, they can't accommodate something else.
Hmm.
And I don't believe that at all. I believe that we can all be very complicated people, that we're allowed to be complicated people because we're human beings, that we're allowed to think of ourselves, that it doesn't mean we're selfish or self-centered by nature, but that we respect our own self-interests. So I gather from your handle, rope aficionado, that you're a rope aficionado and you love rope and you
I
love
do.
to use it. Right.
I,
But that doesn't mean you would use it on everybody.
nope.
That doesn't, you're only going to, you have your own ethical set of like, they have to want to do it, they have to consent to do it, they have to understand what they're getting into. And then I feel ethical doing that thing. So I think a lot of people think that, if you're sexy and you like intricate sex rituals, or you like what I would consider variant sex from the norm, which I'm not even sure is a norm. I don't think there is a norm. I think the norm is that you're all over the place. And at different ages in your life, you may even have completely different sexual needs and desires. But that we do have an ethical construct. And this seems to be true throughout all of the so-called alternative communities. That each community has its own sort of moral standards. And people are not nearly as radical as outsiders may think. We're a community of doctors and lawyers and teachers and social workers and truck drivers and waitresses, and, the list goes on and on. Mm-hmm. And the emphasis is really on having fun and letting, and showing somebody else some fun. So I would say that to me is ethical sex. It isn't about the act. It's about, is your partner equal in consent and desire? Is your partner the right age? Is your partner still alive? Certain taboos do remain, but otherwise, how does it harm anyone? It doesn't. The crazy outrage over people shouldn't be doing that. It's sick. That's foolishness to me. Prove to me how any one of these things could harm you, and then okay, that's why I say, I put pedophilia in a whole different class. I also may not be popular for saying this, but I also love animals, and I don't feel they should be diddled with by human beings either. So, I think.
That's from my perspective. They can't agree to do something.
Exactly, they can't consent. So anybody that is not of age to consent is compromised in some way, so they can't give consent, whether they're too drunk or drugged or something else, or their mental health isn't good, right? And I think one of the things that allowed me to overcome my own anxiety and shame was understanding that it was all consenting adults who were there to have a rousing time.
Well, I think I want to go back. You said, what's normal, right? Thank you. You caught it before I did. What's normal? And I think of Adam's Family. And there's a quote from them. It says, normal is an illusion. What is normal for the spider is chaos for the fly. And I really think about what is normal. Because I go back, and I've said this time and time again on the podcast, I'm a bad boyfriend because I don't know what a good boyfriend is. What's a normal boyfriend? What is a boyfriend? Where is the construct of a boyfriend, and how does it fit into society now? Because when I used to play boyfriend and act like I was a boyfriend because I didn't know how to be a boyfriend, just to be honest, right? That definition was a lot different. The definition of a husband been a little bit more or less the same throughout my history, at least, right? But these other words, they've changed, and I think that a big thing for me was going way back to what you said earlier was language. That I felt like I was a fly, right? And my whole life was chaos because of the the sexual desires that I had that were outside of what my perception of what was normal sexual behavior due to my upbringing, or, you know, internet was just starting to get big, right? And at the point I was on it, I was a minor, so a
Mm-hmm.
little bit finding language, the biggest thing that freed me from shame. I was no longer that fly anymore. I looked, and maybe I was. But I looked around, and there was 30 other flies in the trapped in the same web as me, right? That was looking for the same language as me, and
Mm-hmm.
oh, it wasn't quite so lonely. And then I want to circle back to another thing that you said about harm. Um, I think the most concise way I can say it is that a thought I've been digesting for probably about a month now that a guest gave me was that harm involves third party, right? You have to get medical treatment, mental health treatment, so on and so forth. Harm involves third party. And I've thought about that. And man, I could pick it apart because I could probably think of a few spaces where harm can happen that does not involve third party, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a probably a good 90% basis. And when I think about sex, how does it harm anybody? How does my sexual desires harm anybody as long as I engage with a consenting adult that is aware of activities that are about to take place, so on and so forth? We could add a couple more contingencies to this, but how does that harm anybody? I don't know what your definition of harm is. And I think it's a really hard one. But would you like to try to take a stab at it?
There are two kinds of harm, obviously. There's physical harm and there's emotional harm. So, physical harm is very blatant. So, if you have somebody who's playing rough sex games and they don't care for their partner and they don't use any safety protocols and they don't negotiate or they don't obtain explicit consent, and in my case, I don't just want them to consent, I want them to be eager, right? So eager for the play. Because that would put us on the same page. I don't want to deal with hurting their feelings. If it doesn't, if they didn't really want it, if they were just doing it to please me, but on the inside they had reservations. I think what's perilous out there is that most people don't know themselves and they don't know how they'll react to certain experiences until they have the experience. And I'm not talking about obvious things like banging them in the kidney or, saying something really deliberately mean. But we're all, humans are vulnerable. We're all vulnerable. We're very emotionally vulnerable. So to me, and again, because, I'm in practice and I see hurt people all the time. And for some people, it's just hard to predict. I think your best bet is always to at least feel confident that they want to try it and then be able to provide some comfort if it doesn't go as planned or if they're not as happy as they thought they would be. And I don't think there is any one definition of harm. I could tell you, for example, I think the way we toilet train kids harms a lot of kids because it's during the toilet training that a lot of parents convey the idea that because you're using them to pee, those parts of your body, or poop, those parts of your body are gross and disgusting, and you never mention them, and you never touch them. And you don't let anybody else touch them. And I think kids, as they grow up, even if they can't remember what happened to them at the age of 2, when they were coming out of diapers, they nonetheless remember the idea that there's this part of your body you're never supposed to talk about and never supposed to think about, and you might burn in hell if you do. So one might say that is a very harmful teaching. On the other hand, it's also really common. I mean, there's no better way to get your kid from like playing games with their poop than to make sure that they understand how antisocial it is and that they don't talk about it in public. And, we haven't even figured out that basic step. You know what I mean? Maybe we'll get to Mars, but I think we'll still never figure out the right way to potty train kids so that they don't end up feeling ashamed of those parts of their body. I mean, I think most people growing up, they draw like a circle around that part of their body, in front and in back. And it's sort of the don't go there zone, And depending on how you were raised, where you were raised, maybe if you were raised in nature, you would see so many animals mating around you that whole thing seems pretty natural to you and nothing's really dirty. But if you're in a much more enclosed environment, you're raised in a tight community, you were homeschooled, you go to church a lot, all of that stuff, you may be raised in a world where no one even talks about it, or the information they give you is pretty much in line with your toilet training. Don't think about it, don't touch it, and if you do, you're going to hell, So
it's interesting how we pick up those shame, like that we pick up shame and we don't even know where it came from. Another one that kind of align with that is feet. There tends to be a lot of shame with feet and foot fetishes and so on.
That's like one of the most so that's a great example, because that is literally one of the most harmless fetishes in the universe. Is a guy who wants to kiss feet or lick feet or just worship them or be close to them, right? Or enjoys looking at a pretty foot or enjoys seeing somebody wearing a particular shoe. How in the world could that be harmful? And yet there's such an ick factor about it. I've never understood that.
So for me, it was like, goes back to kind of like what you said, feet are dirty, they're smelly, they're gross, they're,
Right.
Especially men's feet, right? And I have a short story. Well, I'll keep it short. So long story short is I had a slave, negotiated slave, to be clear, in my service, and she kept trying to rub my feet. And this is kind of can be common behavior for MS couples. Is that the slave massages the master's feet. I never was that person. I never commanded people to kiss my feet or rub my feet. And over the course of, probably a year, she kept trying to rub my feet, to kiss my feet, to put on my socks. And I'm just like, I got gross man feet. What are you doing? Right? And that's what it was. I had shame that I didn't even realize I had these gross man feet. And without revealing too many personal details, she finally just looked up to me and said, "You don't take care of your feet. Nobody takes care of your feet for you. I know where they've taken you. I know where they're gonna take you. And I need someone to take care of your feet. And if that needs to be me, it needs to be me. I want to be that person. And she did it a lot better and was a little bit more mushy and gushy about it. And it was just like, oh, it was so sweet. And it felt the level of intimacy and the devotion that she showed. It was my shame around feet with the window right there. Do I ask people to rub my feet? Not inherently. Do I enjoy it? Absolutely. Without shame anymore. I don't have gross man feet anymore. I just got feet. Just like every other human. And if I want to be respectful of my person, I'll at least wash my feet before I get a massage, right? Sometimes I won't.
Let them wash it. That's what they're there for.
That's what you're gonna do, right?
Yeah. And we all have those things, you know? I mean, when I was a kid, I was like so shy about my body. I wouldn't, you know, oh my God, if someone saw me naked, that would have been the end of the world. That's how I remember feeling that way, you know, and then I was ashamed of having breasts. And they were big breasts. I was really embarrassed, you know, and I would try to hide them. And, you know, all of that stuff actually fell away and kind of vanished. I'm still kind of, well, now I'm much older, so, but I still always stayed fairly modest. But that's because I just like that aesthetic, not because I was really ashamed of my body at all. You know, because it made no sense to me.
Well, you brought up
It
something
made no sense to me. Yeah.
that's really accepted is breast. Like, this is the most accepted fetish, in my opinion, in society, because breasts are not inherently sexual, yet it's very, very, very accepted for a guy to, well, are you a boob or a butt guy? Right? And neither boobs or butts are inherently sexual organs, for lack of better terminology. Yet they're very accepted fetishes, whereas feet are not. Why do you think that?
Well, secondary characteristics by nature attract people. Boobs and asses, really, and legs, on the whole, tend to be where the eye goes, what people are looking at, and also crotches. I mean, guys' crotches, women look at those, you know, a lot. You know, and those are just primal instincts. And I think if you see, shame is a good teaching tool to keep us all somewhat civilized. Because if we didn't have some teaching about what's right and what's wrong, what's ethical, what's not ethical, maybe a little shame to inhibit us, we would be like other primates, and that would be scary you know, in human society. But why have we collectively embraced it? I think because it's safe if it's collective. If you actually had to fight for your human rights as a breast worshiper, you might not do it, you know, unless you were really hardcore into it, which is one of the ironies, I mean, sad ironies of, you know, people claiming like, oh, it's a choice you made to be into this fetish, or it's a choice you made to only want to be same-sex partners with a person, or it's a choice you made to... No, the people who live like that are actually the brave people who don't want to compromise on their happiness. They understand themselves. They may not understand you or how you receive them, but they understand what they need, and they're willing to stand up for it. And most people are not that self-aware, and they feel much happier just going along with whatever's popular or trendy or what the culture says, because you end up having more friends, right? You end up having fewer disagreements with people. You end up not having these political arguments over things. You can feel at home in all of the mainstream places. And to other people, that's a small price to pay for living their truths, to give up a world that always felt strange to them in the first place. So most foot fetishists are closeted, 100%. I can say that most of them are in the closet. You won't even know they exist. A sex therapist knows they exist because they will occasionally come out of the closet to talk to me, or at least peek out for a while. And it's just sad to me that people who have, and there are millions and millions of us, who have harmless fetishes, can feel so tortured inside. Mm-hmm. And feel like an outcast from society and walk around feeling like, oh, if anybody knew what I really want or what I'm really thinking, I couldn't fit in society. And so I feel to be a successful society, you have to make a place for everybody. Everybody who is not causing harm. Let's put it that way,
So let's circle back a little bit. Mm-hmm. What role does empowerment play in overcoming shame, sexual shame specifically?
Well, that's the key piece of work that I do in therapy, because I do see people of all different kinds of interests, not just kinky, but they're coping with shame. And sometimes it's a woman who's never, she'll be 50 years old and she's never had the courage to pleasure herself or touch herself, or she has no idea what that part of her body even looks like. And she doesn't want anyone to go down on her, So how do you, it's not as if shame only afflicts kinky people or other sexual minorities. It's really pervasive throughout culture. So how do you help someone like that? You help them to love themselves as a complete entity, not just the brain in a skull cage, but as one complete being, that you are beautiful and desirable head to toe. No matter how old you are, no matter what disabilities you may carry, there is always going to be someone out there to whom you are absolutely wonderful and beautiful. So why can't you appreciate that about yourself? And it's about breaking with the old messaging and learning to quit replaying the same tapes in your head, the negative tapes that say, you shouldn't, you mustn't, you can't. And when you say why, never mind why, you shouldn't, you mustn't, you can't. And I say, hey, maybe you should, maybe you can. If it's important enough to you, then you must. You must embrace yourself. This is your life. You get one.
Yeah.
And even for those of us who age gracefully, it's still never going to last long enough to satisfy any of us. So why not find your own place of peace with your body, your whole body? Instead of just looking at it in a mirror and despairing, give yourself pleasurable sensations so you can experience the true joy of having a body. Whether that's a foot massage, a back rub, caresses, tickles, or getting out your favorite vibrator. Sex is experiential. So I feel very bad for people who never have good sex. And I know there are a lot of them who never do.
Wow. It's crazy to really think about somebody that's in their mid-50s that's never pleasured themselves. I mean, as a 40-year-old man, that's not that far away from where I'm at. So I'm just like, wait a sec. Like, I've pleasured myself a lot. Like, I just can't fathom it. But just that 15-year difference. It's not necessarily a generational gap. I don't think 15
No,
years.
it's not a generational gap. It just, so much goes into it. I mean, that's what makes therapy really intriguing for me, is that, you can have two people, I could have three people the same age, and they all abstain from masturbation. And the reasons why are so different, because everybody has their unique story. It's just that simple. Somebody was raised in X belief system. Somebody may have been molested. Somebody had the worst potty training in the world with an angry parent who said, everything is dirty, it's dirty, I tell you. And the person doesn't even remember it, but grows up with that sense of doom about it. Or, they read a book one time which made them fear it. And not just for religious reasons. I mean, this is part of the reason why I'm so big on sex education, and sex education for adults, especially, because a lot of people still believe the same things about sex that they believed when they were 15. It's almost an insurmountable issue. But you asked me, what have I seen change in 30 years? Well, it may all go away, but for now, what I see is a phenomenal outpouring of people who actually really do want to find the secret of their own happiness and to live that life, to live their happiness before life ends. And I really appreciate them, because in my generation, it was really about keep your head down and just keep plowing ahead. And personal happiness doesn't matter. So I think that's really sad.
Yeah. I guess I didn't really think about, in a year's time and 2 years' time, like a lot of what we know could change.
Yes, it could.
I don't know if
It could
now
change.
that it's going to change or not. I don't know if anybody can predict that.
Things will change, but they don't usually change the way we expect them to, And here's the thing. Even if it goes away now in the US, it'll be reaching new peaks of enlightenment someplace else. And then eventually it may turn around again in America. Because these things cycle. We have periods of, we had the Roaring 20s and the flappers. They were pretty wild, right? But then all that went away. And by the 1950s, it was a nightmare. There was like sex was very popular during and after World War II also. A lot of those boomers aren't telling you the whole truth about what was going on back then. But the 40s were a wild time. People are having tons of sex, of all kinds. There were, what we call swing today started out as key parties back in the 40s and 50s, then wife swapping parties, right? Stuff like that. So it was always there. But then what happened? It all got shut down. Everybody went underground again. Then it started emerging in the 60s, free love. Then free love got smashed down. Everybody said, oh, it's the sexual revolution. It only lasted like 5 years. But it came back again. When AIDS hit the gay community in the 80s, and we lost so many lives, and everybody thought that's the end of the gay community. It wasn't the end of the gay community. It was a tragic loss to the gay community, but the gay community came back and came back stronger. So, I try to be optimistic, and again, I will say I don't believe that history always works out for the best. That would be naive. But I do believe that when it comes to sex, we just are trapped in the history stream. And we're fortunate if we get to see some good times.
That leads me to, it's like perfect. A few of these questions, it's almost like I've seen the future, right? So there's, once again, these external influences that we cannot control. Mm-hmm. And one of them's time. So how can someone maintain their sexual empowerment over time?
By being eternally young, inside, in your soul. By still believing that miracles happen and good things happen and holding on to hope. And by really trying to live your best life and be the better person that, I think we all aspire to be, to do the better job and be the better, I don't mean in a competitive way better than somebody else. I mean the best version of ourselves. And I think we can achieve that. And I think we can find a place of peace and happiness. I feel like that's my job, to show people that they can. But everybody has to, the challenge is that everybody has a different definition of what that would look like. And that's fine. You're entitled to be unique and individualistic. It's about learning your own truth and then accepting yourself as you are, while also being open to constantly improving. And by that, I don't mean just, like what you generally, what people mean by take a lot of self-improvement programs. No, but I mean, do you want to feel less shame? Well, learn to reject some of the old myths that you bought into. Do you want to be happier? Well, find things that fill you with passion and make you relaxed and smile. Do you want to overcome your fetish shame? Do it. Do your fetish. Find somebody who accepts you and loves you as you are and doesn't think you're a deviant, and do it. and reap the pleasure of it. And the happier that that makes you, the further your shame will go away. Don't sit on the sidelines of life, you know, and watch other people do it and wonder why they get to be happy and you don't.
Mm. Mm. So one of the final questions to round out this interview.
I'm running out of steam here, you know.
Yeah,
it's been a while. Yeah.
So in your latest book, Kink So Real, what new insights or approaches do you introduce to help people overcome sexual shame and embrace empowerment?
Well, one of the things that I do in my books, this is a novel, sort of a departure for me. I mean, it's actually, this particular book is short stories, but it's a fiction series that I wrote. And my main characters are very thoughtful people who really do understand the value of being true to themselves. And they carry a lot of very positive, self-accepting values. And I think when you read the book, you can see that they are lovely people whose lives are pretty wild, and yet they're still kind and gentle with each other and ethical. And it's all of a piece. And it's to give people hope that they too, you know, that it's normal people, you know, normal, kind, lovely people can still have the wildest kinks. And it doesn't change who they are, it enhances who they are.
Mm.
That's how I see it. And that for people who know how to live it, it's a gift. Because you get to have experiences that are so profound and meaningful to you.
Right. Last question about you. So what advice or resources would you give to someone looking to free themselves of shame?
Well, everyone is welcome to read my blog at gloriabrame.com. I write every 2 weeks. I publish a blog. If you get on my newsletter, you'll hear from me 1 week with the blog post, and then another week I send interesting reflections, both from my personal life and also what's been, you know, like what's been going on in my practice, my observations about what issues I'm working on with clients, what other people are dealing with, how they handle stuff, everything from shame to fetish things, and, you know, on and on. So I think that I keep it fair, and I keep it very honest, and I keep it very evidence-based as well. And I wish I could just convey, I mean, I think, you know, if you had to boil down like the mega volumes of work I've done over the last 30 years, I think if you could boil it down, I would say sex is just not dirty. Nothing related to eroticism is dirty by nature. People, however, can be dirty. They can be mean, they can be cruel, they can be exploitative, you know? So it's really, don't police your own sexuality, but be wise in your choices of partners. You know?
That last thought, I love it. I love it. That sex is not dirty, but people can be. That is it in a nutshell. So, nonetheless, my final question. Shameless plugs. When's your next book coming out? Where can we see you?
I just published this book of short stories, and I think it's got pretty much everything. It's very steamy. It has a lot of explicit scenes. I picked 2 wild fetishes, an anal fetish and a grown woman who wants to be treated like a baby. And it's got masters and mistresses and subs and slaves and people of all ages and all choices. And it's about the value of having a chosen family and how meaningful it can be to have a chosen family of adults who stick by each other's sides and try to support each other through good times and bad. And the power of that experience. So I think it's, you know, I want people to tap into the goodness of life more.
Me too. I cannot say how much I appreciate your time
You're
tonight.
very welcome.
It was thought-provoking. Definitely thought-provoking. I mean, I guess maybe I was very naive to think that the world that I know of being a content creator in the adult space, that next week, next month, next year, you may not have that luxury, we'll say. So thank you for injecting that into my head. But
sorry.
no. I appreciate all the thoughts. I really do.
You know, the reality is, though, that the work always goes on. It just, it happens in different spaces.
Yeah, I wouldn't stop, but the internet and how public I am might change. I don't want to get lost on a tangent. Yeah, right. No, the work just changes, like you said.
Right.
So we will wrap this up. Otherwise, we'll keep talking about.
Yeah, so, right, all night. Okay.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Dominance Dialogues. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, be sure to subscribe and share. As always, stay